The war chamber of the Vrithian Empire was cold and dark and enormous. Not the kind of cold that comes from a broken heating system or a room that nobody has used in a while. This was a deliberate cold. Designed cold. The kind that was kept that way on purpose because the beings who ruled from this room had decided long ago that warmth was for species that had not yet learned what power actually felt like. The air inside the chamber carried no smell, no humidity, nothing soft or comfortable about it. Just clean, empty cold pressing against every surface. The room itself was massive. So large that the far walls disappeared into shadow even when every light was running at full strength. The ceiling arched high overhead in a curve of dark stone that had been carved from a mountain on the Vrithian home world and transported here piece by piece over the course of 3 years because Reth had wanted the chamber to feel like the inside of something ancient and immovable. He had succeeded. Standing in the center of it, you felt the weight of the place the way you feel the weight of deep water. Pressing down. Reminding you of its size every second. The walls were covered in maps. Floor to ceiling on every side. Hundreds of them overlapping in places, each one showing a different world, a different star system, a different civilization that had once existed as something independent and self-determined and had then encountered the Vrithian Empire and stopped being those things. Some of the maps were old. The ink faded, the borders drawn in styles that nobody used anymore, the star charts reflecting positions that had shifted over centuries. Others were recent. Clean lines and sharp detail and coordinates that matched current navigation databases exactly. Every single map told the same story. Here was a world. Here was a people. Here is what they had. And then here is what happened when the Vrithian fleet arrived. Supreme Commander Reth stood in the center of the chamber beneath the highest point of the arched ceiling and looked at the scout report in his hands. He was a large being even by Vrithian standards. 8 feet of dense muscle wrapped in natural armor plating that ran from his shoulders down his back and across his chest and overlapping gray plates that had never been pierced in 40 years of command. 4 arms, each one ending in 4 thick fingers that could bend steel bars without much effort. 4 red eyes set in a wide flat face that had learned over decades to show exactly as much expression as Reth decided it should show and nothing more. He held the report the way someone holds a document they already know the conclusion of before they finish reading it. Loosely. With one hand. The other 3 arms were crossed over his chest in the resting position that his staff had learned to recognize as the posture he adopted when something was too small to deserve his full attention. The report was about a species called humans. He had read intelligence summaries on hundreds of species over his career. Most of them followed the same pattern. New civilization discovered. Scout units dispatched. Report compiled. Assessment delivered. Decision made. The details changed but the structure never did. And the conclusion almost never surprised him anymore because after 40 years the species you encountered began to fall into categories that you recognized quickly and the humans fell into a category he had seen many times before. One home world sitting in a quiet corner of a minor star system. A handful of small colonial settlements on nearby planets, none of them particularly developed, none of them particularly defended. Spacecraft that were functional but modest, built more for exploration and transport than for any serious military application. Their largest vessel would have fit comfortably in the landing bay of a mid-sized Vrithian cruiser with room to spare. Technology that was centuries behind Vrithian standards in almost every measurable category. Energy systems, propulsion, materials science, artificial intelligence, weapons development. Across the board, behind. Not embarrassingly behind. They were clearly an intelligent species that was moving in the right direction. But direction and destination are different things and they had a very long road ahead of them before they would arrive anywhere that mattered. Reth stopped reading after the first page. He had enough. The picture was clear. He had seen it before and he would see it again and the response was always the same because the response always worked. He looked up at General Moan who was standing quietly near the edge of the chamber with his hands folded in front of him and his eyes doing that thing they always did where they were pointed at Reth but actually looking at something slightly past him, some middle distance where Moan did his actual thinking while appearing to pay attention. Send 1 fleet, Reth said. 200 ships. That is more than enough. Moan nodded once. He had a long face and careful eyes and the particular posture of an officer who had spent 30 years being the second most important person in every room and had made his peace with that position long ago. He was good at his job. He was also good at reading situations that his superior had already decided were not worth reading carefully. He said nothing. Reth set the report down on the edge of the great stone table that ran the length of the chamber and walked toward the doors on the far side. His footsteps echoed in the cold air. The maps watched him go from every wall, All those conquered worlds reduced to lines and coordinates, and the quiet testimony of what happened when the Empire decided something needed to be dealt with. The doors opened and closed behind him. Moan stood in the silence for a moment. Then he walked to the table and picked up the report. He started reading from the beginning. Not skimming. Actually reading. Every line, every data point, every section that the scout units had compiled during their observation period around the human home world. He read about their governments and their history and their social structures and their military development and their technology programs. He read the analysis sections and the comparison tables and the behavioral assessment notes that the AI units always attached at the end. He was a careful reader by nature and by habit and by the hard experience of 30 years watching what happened when careful reading was skipped. His eyes stopped near the bottom of the final page. The Scout AI had flagged a single behavioral note and formatted it differently from the rest of the text, the way the AI units did when they wanted to make sure the human reading the report did not move past something without registering it. It said this: behavioral analysis indicates this species does not retreat under pressure. Combat data from internal historical conflicts shows aggression levels increase significantly when this species is threatened rather than decreasing as observed in the majority of cataloged civilizations. Unconventional tactical approaches documented across multiple conflict periods. Recommend full threat assessment before any military engagement. Moan read it twice. Then he looked at the door that Reth had walked through. The heavy stone door that was now closed. He could hear activity on the other side of it. Staff moving. Orders being relayed. The machinery of the Empire beginning to move in the direction Reth had pointed it. Moan looked back at the note. He thought about the phrase aggression levels increase when threatened. He thought about what that meant in practical terms for a military engagement. Most species, when they encountered a force significantly larger than their own, made a rational calculation. The calculation was simple and understandable and led to predictable behavior. They backed down. They negotiated. They surrendered or they fled or they asked for terms. It was not cowardice. It was just math. When the numbers are not in your favor, the sensible thing is to acknowledge the numbers. A species whose aggression increased under threat was not doing math. It was doing something else entirely, and Moan had spent enough time studying military history to know that something else was very difficult to plan around. He thought about saying something. He thought about walking through that door and finding Reth and telling him that the report had a note worth discussing before the fleet launched. He thought about the conversation that would follow. He thought about Reth's face and Reth's voice and the 40 years of unbroken victories that sat behind every decision Reth made like a wall that no counter-argument had ever managed to get over. Moan folded the report carefully and set it back on the table. He walked to his own station and began processing the fleet deployment orders that were already coming through the system. 200 warships. Departure in 50 minutes. Course set for human space. He worked through the paperwork with the quiet efficiency that had defined his entire career. Every form completed correctly. Every authorization logged properly. Every detail handled the way it was supposed to be handled. The fleet launched within the hour. 200 Vrithian warships moving through space toward a species that had never been contacted by another civilization. Moving with the easy confidence of a force that had done this exact thing many times before and had never once been surprised by what happened next. In the war chamber, the maps covered the walls and the cold air sat still, and the report with its flagged behavioral note lay folded on the edge of the great stone table where Moan had set it down. Nobody went back to read it. Across the Empire, nobody gave the mission a second thought. It was a routine deployment against a minor species. The kind of thing that resolved itself quickly and generated a single-page follow-up report that got filed and forgotten. That was the first mistake. The second mistake was believing that a species whose aggression increased under pressure would respond to 200 warships the way every other species had responded. The third mistake was not reading to the end of the report. But of course, by the time anyone understood that those were mistakes, the fleet was already gone and the stars ahead of it were already growing closer, and somewhere in the quiet dark of a minor solar system a species that had never heard of the Vrithian Empire was going about its day completely unaware that something very large and very confident was coming toward it. That was about to change. Commander Bill Hayes got the call at 3 in the morning. He was already awake. That was not unusual for him. Bill had a particular relationship with sleep that most people who worked alongside him had noticed over the years but rarely mentioned out loud. When everything was calm and routine and nothing required immediate attention, he slept fine. 7 hours, no interruptions, up before his alarm. But when something was wrong, when some part of his brain that he had never been fully able to explain to anyone was picking up signals that his conscious mind had not yet processed, he woke up. Sometimes hours before anything confirmed it. Sometimes days. For 3 days something had been feeling wrong. He had not been able to point to a specific reason. The sensor reports had been normal. The patrol schedules had been running without incident. Nobody had flagged anything unusual in the deep space monitoring logs. Everything on paper was fine. But Bill had spent 22 years in deep space defense, and he had learned a long time ago that paper and reality were two different things, and that the gap between them was exactly where the dangerous surprises lived. So he had been awake. Sitting in the dim light of Earth's Deep Space Defense Command Center in the quiet hours before the day shift arrived, drinking coffee that had gone cold an hour ago, watching screens that showed him nothing alarming, and trusting his gut more than he trusted the screens. Lieutenant Amy Cole came through the door at 3:14 in the morning, moving faster than she usually moved. Amy was not a person who rushed. She was 29 years old and had been working sensor analysis for 4 years, and she had the particular steadiness of someone who had trained herself to process information before reacting to it, because she had learned early that reacting first and thinking second was how mistakes happened. When Amy moved quickly, it meant something had already passed through her internal filter and come out the other side still alarming. She placed the sensor report on the desk in front of Bill without saying anything first. That was also not like her. Bill looked at the report. 200 Vrithian warships. Already crossing into the outer solar system. Moving at a speed that put them inside combat range in hours, not days. No communication signal sent ahead. No standard identification broadcast. No diplomatic contact of any kind. No warning. Just coming. Bill read through the full sensor data twice. The readings were clean and consistent across multiple independent monitoring stations, which meant it was not a glitch, and it was not interference, and it was not the kind of false positive that occasionally showed up in deep space sensor networks and wasted everyone's morning. It was real. 200 warships real. Amy stood on the other side of the desk and watched his face the way junior officers watch senior ones when the information they have just delivered is bad and they are trying to figure out how bad the senior officer thinks it is. "Sir," she said. "We have 38 ships." She did not say it the way someone says something obvious. She said it the way someone says something that needs to be in the room. 38 against 200 was a number that deserved to be spoken out loud, so that both of them were definitely thinking about the same reality. Bill looked at the numbers for a long moment. Not panicking. Not doing the calculation that most people would immediately do when confronted with those two numbers side by side. He was doing something different. He was thinking about what the numbers meant beyond the obvious surface of them. What they said about the force that was coming. What they revealed about the assumptions behind sending 200 ships instead of 10 or 50 or 1,000. 200 ships was a specific kind of number. It was not the number you sent when you expected a real fight. It was the number you sent when you expected the other side to look at your fleet and make the sensible calculation and stand down without forcing you to actually use it. 200 ships was an intimidation number. A show of force number. The kind of deployment that said, "We are serious and you should not make us prove it." It meant whoever was coming believed that showing up was most of the work. Bill picked up his coffee and took a slow sip. It was cold. He drank it anyway and set the cup back down with the careful, deliberate movement of someone choosing to stay calm, not because the situation did not warrant alarm, but because alarm was not going to help anything and calm might. "Get me Captain Tom Ward," he said. Amy had Tom on the line in 4 minutes, which meant she had already anticipated the request and started the connection before Bill finished asking for it. Bill noted that without commenting on it. He had good people. That mattered more right now than almost anything else. Tom Ward's face appeared on the screen, looking exactly like a person who had been asleep 12 minutes ago and had not wasted any of those 12 minutes being confused about it. He was somewhere in his early 50s with a broad face and dark eyes and the expression of someone who had been woken up with bad news enough times in his career that he had developed a kind of immediate functional readiness for it. No easing in. No asking what time it was. Just present and focused and waiting. Bill gave him the situation in 3 sentences. 200 Vrithian warships crossing into the outer solar system. No communication. Hours until they are in range. Tom listened without interrupting. He did not ask how sure they were. He did not ask if they had tried contacting the incoming fleet. He understood from the way Bill delivered the information that both of those questions had already been handled. When Bill finished talking, there was a pause of about 4 seconds that was not hesitation but processing. Then Tom said, "Understood. On my way." The screen went dark. Bill pulled up the tactical display and expanded it to show the full solar system. The Vrithian formation appeared as a cluster of red markers moving in from the outer edge, tight and perfectly spaced, every ship holding its position relative to the others with a precision that spoke to either very good discipline or very good automation or both. The formation had a shape that Bill recognized from his studies of how large organized military forces typically moved when they were confident. Broad front. Layered depth. The kind of arrangement designed to present a wall that a panicking enemy would look at and decide was too large and too solid to fight through. It was a formation built on an assumption. The assumption that the thing in front of it would panic. Bill studied it for a long time. He thought about the geometry of it, about the gaps between the ships and the angles of approach and the way the formation would have to adjust if the thing in front of it did not behave the way it was supposed to behave. A tight, disciplined formation was strong in the situations it was designed for. But tight and disciplined also meant predictable. It meant every ship in the formation was committed to a position, and changing that position required coordination, and coordination required time, and time was something you did not always have when the battle stopped following the script. He thought about 38 ships. He thought about what 38 ships could do if they stopped trying to be a wall and started trying to be something else entirely. Bill opened the fleet-wide channel. Every human ship in the solar system could hear him. Patrol vessels. Defense platforms. The converted cargo ships that had been quietly fitted with weapon systems over the last several years as part of a program that very few people outside this room knew the full details of. Every crew member on every vessel that Earth had available was suddenly listening to the same voice in the same moment. Bill did not give a long speech. He was not a long speech kind of commander. He said what needed to be said in the fewest words that would carry it fully. This is Hayes. Everyone listen carefully. They came here expecting fear. We are going to show them something they have never seen before. Move to your positions and wait for my mark. He closed the channel. Across the solar system, 38 human ships began moving. Not in a neat formation. Not in the kind of tight organized lines that mirrored what the Vrithians would recognize and know how to respond to. They spread out through the solar system in a pattern that from the outside looked loose and uncoordinated, ships moving to positions that seemed to have no obvious relationship to each other, no clear defensive line, no concentrated point of strength. It did not look like a military formation. It looked like 38 ships that were not quite sure what to do. That was entirely intentional. Each ship was moving to a specific position that Bill had calculated over the past 3 days during the hours he had been awake and unable to explain to himself exactly why he was awake. Each position made sense in relation to the others in ways that would not be visible until the moment they needed to be visible. The solar system itself was part of the plan. The gravity of the outer planets. The positioning of the asteroid belt. The long shadows cast by Jupiter that could hide a fast-moving ship from certain sensor angles for just long enough. Bill had grown up reading about every military engagement in human history that he could find. Not just the famous ones. The small ones. The ones that nobody taught in schools because they did not involve famous names or turning points in large wars. The ones where a smaller force had faced a larger one and found a way to make the larger one fight the wrong battle. He had read those accounts the way other people read stories, looking for the moment where the smaller side had seen something the larger side had not seen, where patience and positioning and a willingness to let the other side make the first assumption had turned a bad set of numbers into a survivable situation. He had been thinking about those accounts for 3 days. Amy was standing near her station watching the display as the human ships moved into position across the solar system. She was quiet for a moment. Then she looked at Bill. "Do you think this will work?" she asked. It was an honest question. Not a frightened one. The kind you ask when you genuinely want to know what the person with more experience actually believes. Bill watched the screen for a moment. The red markers of the Vrithian fleet moving steadily inward. The scattered positions of 38 human ships that from the outside looked like confusion and from the inside looked like something else entirely. "They came here expecting to frighten us into standing still," he said. "The moment we stop standing still, they are going to have a problem they did not plan for." He picked up his cold coffee again. "So no. I do not think this will work the way they think it will work. I think it will work the way we need it to work. Those are different things, and right now that difference is the only advantage we have." He drank the last of the cold coffee and set the cup down and turned back to the display. Outside in the dark of the solar system, 38 ships held their positions and waited. Patient and quiet, and already 3 steps ahead of a fleet that had 200 ships and one very important assumption that was about to be tested. Vrithian Fleet Commander Dross had crushed 14 civilizations. Not defeated. Not pushed back. Crushed. That was the word his record used, and it was the right word because it described exactly what had happened each time. A civilization would be identified. A fleet would be sent. Dross would arrive. He would open a channel and deliver the speech, and the other side would look at his ships and make the only rational calculation available to them, and then it would be over. Clean. Fast. Predictable. 14 times. Across 40 years of service. The same result every single time. Dross was not an unintelligent being. He had not risen to fleet commander through luck or politics. He had studied military theory and applied it and refined his understanding through actual experience, and he was genuinely good at what he did. But there is a particular kind of blindness that comes from success. Not stupidity. Something more subtle than that. When something has worked 14 times in a row, the mind begins to treat it not as a strategy that has worked but as a law that cannot fail. The distinction is small, but it matters enormously, and Dross had long since stopped feeling it. He stood on the bridge of his flagship and looked at the sensor display showing the human fleet scattered across the solar system ahead of him, and felt the familiar settled confidence of a commander who already knows how the next few hours will go. The human ships were spread out in a pattern that had no obvious military logic to it. No concentrated defensive formation. No clear line of engagement. Just 38 vessels sitting in various positions across a wide area of space, as if they had not quite decided what to do yet. Dross had seen this before. Species that had never faced a real military threat often did not know how to arrange themselves when one arrived. They scattered. They hesitated. They made decisions based on instinct rather than training, and instinct without training produced exactly this kind of disorganized picture. It confirmed what he already believed. This would be straightforward. He opened the channel to the human fleet and straightened up slightly the way he always did before delivering the speech. Not for the humans. Just habit. 40 years of the same gesture before the same words. He spoke clearly and without particular emphasis because the words themselves carried enough weight, and adding drama to them had always struck him as unnecessary. Surrender your world or be destroyed. You have 1 hour to respond. He waited. On the other end of the channel he could see Captain Tom Ward. A human male of middle age sitting in a command chair on the bridge of a vessel that was small enough to fit in the landing bay of Dross's flagship. The human listened to every word of the speech with his eyes level and his expression giving away nothing. No visible fear. No visible anger. No visible reaction of any kind that Dross could read clearly. When Dross finished speaking there was a silence of about 3 seconds. Then Tom Ward reached forward and closed the channel. No response. No counteroffer. No request for clarification or more time. No attempt at negotiation. No surrender and no defiance. Just the channel closing with a quiet click and the screen going dark and the connection ending as if the speech had been a wrong number call that the recipient had politely but firmly declined to engage with. Dross stared at his screen. In 40 years. Across 14 civilizations. Hundreds of individual interactions with species that had found themselves on the receiving end of that speech. Not one of them had ever simply closed the channel without saying anything. Not one. He stood very still for a moment. Something moved through him that he did not immediately have a name for. It was not quite surprise, because surprise implied that the possibility had existed somewhere in his mind and he had dismissed it. This was something that had not existed anywhere in his mind at all. A thing that had simply not been in the category of things that could happen. Then the part of him that was a fleet commander for 40 years pushed everything else aside and he ordered the fleet to advance. Whatever the humans were doing or not doing, they had declined the offer, and the next step was not his to choose. They had chosen it for him. The Vrithian formation moved forward. 200 warships in perfect arrangement crossing the distance toward the scattered human ships at combat speed. Dross watched his display and waited for the human vessels to react the way vessels reacted when 200 warships accelerated toward them. To bunch together or scatter further or attempt to retreat toward their home world. Any of those responses he could handle in his sleep. The human ships did not do any of those things. They started moving, and the way they moved made no sense to Dross for the first 30 seconds. Individual ships and small groups of 2 and 3 breaking in different directions simultaneously. Not away from the Vrithian formation. Not toward it in any kind of organized charge. Just moving. Fast and low and at angles that seemed almost random. Cutting across the paths of other ships. Changing direction with a speed that suggested engines being pushed harder than standard combat protocols recommended. Dross started issuing targeting orders and immediately ran into a problem. The human ships were not staying where his targeting systems expected them to be. They moved constantly and they moved unpredictably, and they did not move in the straight lines or the standard evasion curves that Vrithian combat software had been designed to track. The tracking systems kept adjusting and the ships kept not being where the adjustments anticipated, and the gap between where the system said a human vessel would be and where it actually was kept being just large enough to matter. Then Tom Ward did something that Dross had genuinely never seen before in 40 years of space combat. He flew his ship directly into the center of the Vrithian formation. Not at it. Not toward the edge of it looking for a weak point to push through. Into the center. The middle of 200 warships. The place where by any conventional military logic a single small vessel had absolutely no business being and no way of surviving. Dross stared at his tactical display and for a moment could not process what he was seeing because it did not fit any category of tactical behavior he had ever studied or encountered. You did not fly into the center of a superior force. There was no version of military theory that recommended this. It was the kind of thing that looked on paper like either a catastrophic mistake or a complete loss of control of the vessel. It was neither. What Tom had understood, and what took Dross several seconds too long to understand, was that the center of a tight formation was actually the one place in the entire battle space where the ships surrounding you could not fire freely. Not without risking hitting each other. 200 warships in a close formation had overlapping fields of fire that worked perfectly against a target outside the formation and became a serious liability against a target inside it. Every shot required a calculation about what was on the other side of the target. Every missed shot became a potential hit on a friendly vessel. Tom flew through the center of that formation like he owned it, and Dross watched 3 of his warships destroy each other trying to track one human vessel that kept being somewhere slightly different from where their weapons were pointed. 3 ships. Gone. From friendly fire. In the first 8 minutes. Dross started issuing new orders, and the orders were good orders, and under normal circumstances they would have helped, but the circumstances were not normal because while he was focused on the problem in the center of his formation, he was not focused on what was happening at the edges, and the edges were where Bill Hayes was working. Bill sat in the command center on Earth and watched the battle on his display with the particular quality of attention that very experienced people bring to very high-stakes situations. Not frantic. Not frozen. Just completely present. Reading the display the way someone reads a language they have spoken for 20 years, instantly and without effort, understanding not just what each element meant individually but what all of them meant together in relation to each other. He issued adjustments in a quiet, steady voice. Move left. Pull back. Redirect east. For ships to the northern approach. Hold that position for 90 seconds, then break right. Each adjustment was small. None of them looked dramatic from the outside. But each one was responding to something Dross had just done or was about to do, and together they added up to a battle that kept refusing to become the battle Dross knew how to fight. The human ships never gave the Vrithian formation a fixed target to organize against. Every time Dross established a response, the thing he was responding to had already changed. His formation was built for a kind of combat where both sides committed to positions and pushed against each other until one side broke. The humans would not commit to positions. They treated the entire solar system as the battlefield and used all of it constantly, and the Vrithian formation, which was powerful and disciplined and exactly right for the kind of battle it had been built for, kept finding itself optimized for a situation that no longer existed. It went on for 2 hours. Not 2 hours of constant firing. 2 hours of a battle that kept shifting and adjusting and refusing to resolve into the clean, decisive engagement that Dross needed it to be. Every time he felt like he was getting control of it, something changed and he was reacting again instead of acting. When it finally ended, the silence on the bridge of his flagship felt different from normal battle silence. Dross looked at his display. Then he looked at his casualty report. Then he looked at the casualty report again because the first reading had produced a number that did not match the reality he had been living inside for the past 40 years, and he needed to verify it. 31 Vrithian ships lost or disabled. Against a force of 38 that should have been outmatched in every category that military analysis used to predict outcomes. Human losses. 4 ships. Dross sat down in his command chair. He was not a being who sat down during active duty situations. He stood. Always. It was habit and principle and the physical expression of command presence. He sat down now because his legs had made a decision independently of his intentions. He read the numbers a 3rd time. They did not change. He thought about the speech he had given so many times. Surrender your world or be destroyed. He thought about Tom Ward closing the channel without saying anything. He thought about 3 of his own ships destroying each other in the center of his own formation. He thought about 2 hours of fighting a battle that had never once felt like the battle he had prepared to fight. He opened the emergency channel to Reth. His voice when he spoke was level and professional because he was a fleet commander with 40 years of service, and he was not going to fall apart on an open channel regardless of what the numbers on his screen said. He told Reth what had happened. He told him the losses. He told him that the human ships were unlike anything in the engagement database and that the tactics they had used did not match any documented pattern and that his current force was not sufficient to complete the mission. Then he said the words he had never said once in 40 years. He needed more ships. Immediately. He closed the channel and sat in the silence of his bridge and looked at a display that showed 31 empty spaces where his warships used to be, and thought about a human captain who had flown straight into the center of 200 ships and come out the other side. He thought about the behavioral note in the scout report that he had never read because nobody had told him it was there. He thought about what it might have said. Reth read Dross's report standing up and did not sit down for a long time afterward. He stood at the edge of the great stone table in the war chamber and held the report in two of his four hands and read it the way he had not read anything in a very long time. Carefully. All the way through. Every line. Every number. Every detail that Dross had included in the kind of precise military language that strips emotion out of events and presents them as data points. Reth read all of it, and when he finished he went back and read the casualty section again because the first time through his mind had done something it had never done before with a casualty report. It had refused to fully accept the numbers and moved on anyway, the way your eyes sometimes skip a word in a sentence and your brain fills in something that makes more sense, and Reth needed to make sure he had actually read what was there and not what he expected to be there. 31 ships. Against 38 human vessels that by every measurement the Empire used to assess military capability should have been overwhelmed and neutralized in the opening minutes of the engagement. 31 Vrithian warships lost or disabled against a force that had no business still being functional after the first exchange. Human losses. 4 ships. Reth set the report down on the table. The war chamber was quiet around him the way it was always quiet. Cold air. Maps on every wall. The low hum of the climate systems that kept the temperature exactly where Reth had always kept it. Everything exactly the same as it had been this morning when the biggest concern on his mind was a minor administrative dispute between 2 Outer Rim governors that he had been putting off dealing with for a week. Everything exactly the same except for the numbers sitting on the table in front of him. He did not move for a while. He stood there with his 4 arms at his sides and looked at the report and worked through what the numbers meant. Not emotionally. Reth was not particularly given to emotional processing of information. Analytically. What did 31 ships against 4 actually tell you about the force that had produced that result? What did it imply about the engagement that had generated it? What did it mean for the next step? The answer to the last question came quickly, and it came with the kind of certainty that 40 years of command produces in a being who has always solved problems by applying more force than the problem can resist. When something pushes back harder than expected, you do not adjust your approach. You increase the pressure until the resistance breaks. That was how it had always worked. That was how it would work now. He ordered everything. Not a reinforcement. Not a second fleet to support Dross. Everything. 3,000 warships pulled from every corner of Vrithian territory. Ships that had been on patrol routes and garrison assignments and training exercises and diplomatic escort duties. Every vessel the Empire had available pointed at one small solar system at the edge of explored space. The largest single military deployment the Vrithian Empire had made in over 200 years, assembled and directed at a species that 6 days ago nobody in the Empire had given a serious thought. General Moan had been standing in the far corner of the war chamber since Reth started reading the report. He had not moved. He had not spoken. He had watched Reth read and watched Reth's face and watched the particular stillness that had settled over the commander while he processed what the numbers said. Moan was good at reading rooms, and he was especially good at reading this room and this particular person in it, and he had been quietly preparing himself for the moment when he would need to decide whether to say the thing he was thinking or keep it behind his teeth the way he had kept the behavioral note behind his teeth 2 days ago. He decided to say it. What if sending everything is exactly what they want us to do, he said. His voice was quiet and even. Not challenging. Just placing a thought in the room and letting it sit there. Reth looked at him. The look lasted about 4 seconds. Moan held it without flinching because he had been holding Reth's looks for 30 years and he had learned that flinching was the thing that ended conversations before they could become useful. Then Reth looked away and gave the order anyway. Moan watched him go and then stood alone in the war chamber for a moment with the maps on the walls and the cold air and the report on the table and thought about the behavioral note he had read 2 days ago. Aggression increases when threatened. He thought about what 3,000 warships bearing down on a species like that actually meant in practical terms. Whether the thing you were hoping to trigger by showing overwhelming force was surrender or something else entirely. He did not have an answer that felt comfortable. He went to process the deployment orders. On Earth, the intelligence report arrived at Bill Hayes' desk 4 hours after Reth gave the order, carried through a chain of deep space monitoring stations that humanity had spent 11 years positioning and that very few people outside this building knew existed. Bill read it once. Then he sat with it. 3,000 ships. He let that number exist in the room for a moment without trying to immediately solve it. Just let it be what it was. 3,000 Vrithian warships representing the full military force of an empire that had been conquering civilizations for centuries, all of it now pointed directly at Earth. He pulled up his fleet count on the secondary screen. 94 vessels. Every ship Earth had available, including the reserve units that had not been on active deployment in 2 years and the converted cargo ships that had been fitted with weapon systems as part of a program that had been running quietly for a decade under a budget line that was labeled infrastructure maintenance in the public records because nobody had wanted to explain to a civilian population exactly what they were preparing for. 94 against 3,000. Bill looked at those two numbers sitting next to each other on his screen for a long time. He was not a person who pretended numbers did not mean what they meant. He was also not a person who believed that numbers were the whole story. He had spent 22 years studying the gap between what numbers predicted and what actually happened, and he had filled that gap with plans and preparations and programs that most people in this building had never been fully briefed on, because the day you needed them was the day you needed everyone focused on execution rather than on being surprised by the existence of the plan. He opened a second screen. The program that came up had been running for 14 years under a classification level that required a specific key that only 4 people on Earth possessed. It showed a map of the solar system with thousands of small markers spread across every major approach vector. Every logical path that a large fleet would take when moving from the outer edge of the system toward the inner planets where Earth sat. Each marker was a mine. Not the crude explosive devices that the word suggested. Precisely engineered pieces of hardware that had been designed over 8 years of development specifically to be invisible to Vrithian sensor technology. The Vrithian sensor suite operated on a specific frequency range using a specific detection method that human engineers had spent years reverse engineering from the limited data available on Vrithian technology. The mines did not emit anything that fell within that range. They sat in the dark between the stars and breathed nothing and showed nothing and waited with the particular patience of things that do not have the capacity for impatience. Thousands of them. Across every path a 3,000 ship fleet would take to reach Earth. Bill looked at the map for a moment. Then he opened the second file. Project Anvil had started as a theoretical paper written by a defense engineer named Ray Kowalski who had been trying to solve a specific problem. The problem was this. If you were facing a fleet significantly larger than your own, the conventional approach of matching force against force would not work because the numbers were too far apart. But a large fleet had a vulnerability that a small fleet did not. Coordination. 3,000 ships had to communicate with each other constantly to function as a single force. They had to share targeting data and formation updates and tactical adjustments in real time across the entire fleet. Disrupt that communication on a large enough scale and a 3,000 ship fleet stopped being one force and became 3,000 individual ships making individual decisions with no shared picture of the battle. Project Anvil was 40 modified cargo ships. Each one had been stripped of everything that was not essential to its single purpose and fitted with a device that had taken 6 years to develop and test. The device did one thing. When triggered, it broadcast a disruption signal across every communication frequency the Vrithian fleet used simultaneously, generating enough interference to collapse coordination across an entire fleet section for a window of several minutes. 40 ships. 40 windows of disruption. Triggered in sequence at the right moments across the right sections of a 3,000 ship formation. It had never been tried. There was no historical precedent for it because nobody had ever built 40 cargo ships into communication disruption weapons before. It was the kind of plan that sounded completely reasonable when you explained the theory and completely insane when you looked at the scale of what it was trying to effect. Bill called Tom Ward. Tom arrived at the command center 40 minutes later and Bill walked him through both programs. The mines. Project Anvil. The sequence he had worked out for how they would be used together. Tom listened the whole way through without interrupting, which was his habit, and when Bill finished, Tom was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet when he was running the plan through his own internal assessment process. Then he said exactly what Bill had expected him to say. "This is completely insane." Bill nodded. "Yes. You want to use cargo ships to collapse the communications of 3,000 warships. In sequence." "Yes." Tom looked at the display showing the Vrithian fleet moving through deep space toward them. 3,000 red markers in a formation so large it covered a significant portion of the tactical screen. Then he looked at the 94 blue markers representing everything humanity had available. "Do you have a better idea?" Bill said. Tom thought about it. He stood there and genuinely thought about it for about 30 seconds, which was long enough that Bill started wondering if Tom had actually come up with something else. Then Tom looked at him and said no. "Then let us get to work," Bill said. Tom turned to go and then stopped. He stood with his back to Bill for a moment and looked at the display one more time. At the 3,000 markers moving steadily closer. "Bill," he said. "Yes. When this works." He paused. "Not if. When. What do you think they are going to do next?" Bill thought about it honestly. About an empire that had just committed its entire military force to a single engagement and was about to watch that force fail in a way it had never anticipated. About the pride and the fury and the complete disbelief that would follow. About what a civilization that had always answered resistance with more force would do when more force stopped being an available answer. I think, Bill said slowly, that they are going to have to decide what they actually are. Underneath all the ships and all the history and all the worlds on those maps in Reth's war chamber. What they actually are when the force stops working. Tom nodded slowly. Then he went to get his crew ready. 3,000 Vrithian warships came out of faster-than-light travel and filled space like a second sky. They appeared all at once across a wide front, dropping back into normal space in the coordinated sequence that the Vrithian fleet had practiced thousands of times, each ship taking its position in the formation with the automatic precision of a force that had done this so many times it had become reflex. The sight of it on any sensor display was genuinely staggering. 3,000 individual vessels arranged in layered rows that stretched across millions of kilometers of space, their engines burning in the dark, their weapons armed and ready, the full accumulated military power of an empire that had been building and expanding and conquering for centuries, all pointed in one direction. Toward one small solar system. Toward 94 ships. Reth stood on the bridge of his command vessel at the rear of the formation and looked at his sensor display and felt something loosen in his chest that had been tight since he read Dross's report. This was the picture that made sense. This was what overwhelming force actually looked like when you committed to it properly. 94 human vessels sitting ahead of 3,000 warships. The ratio was so lopsided it barely registered as a military situation. It registered as a conclusion that had not quite happened yet. He felt his confidence come back all at once, and it came back completely the way confidence does when it has been briefly shaken and then given a reason to return. He looked at the formation around him and thought about Dross's report and thought about 31 ships and thought that whatever the humans had done to produce that result, they had done it against 200 ships, and 200 ships was not 3,000, and the difference between those two numbers was the difference between a test and a certainty. He gave the order to advance. Then the mines activated. There was no sound because there is no sound in space, but if there had been sound it would have been the sound of silence spreading. One ship going dark. Then 3. Then a dozen at once across the leading edge of the formation. Then more, faster, the darkness moving through the front ranks of the armada like a wave rolling through deep water, steady and unstoppable and coming from no visible source. Reth stared at his tactical display, and the display showed him ships going offline and showed him nothing else because there was nothing else to show. No attacking vessels. No weapons fire registering on sensors. No source that his instruments could identify or locate or point at. Just his ships. Going dark. One after another across a front that stretched further than his sensors could cleanly resolve. 600 of them before the pattern slowed. 600 warships sitting silent and powerless in the dark without a single visible thing having touched them. Reth issued rapid orders to the ships behind the affected front. Pull back. Hold formation. Find the source. The orders went out and the responses came back, and none of the responses contained the information he needed because the ships trying to find the source could not find it either. The mines sat in the dark and showed nothing and said nothing, and the Vrithian sensor systems swept through their standard detection ranges and found empty space exactly where the mines were sitting. Reth had a fleet of 3,000 ships and 600 of them were already gone, and he did not know what had taken them. He did not have long to think about it. The human fleet moved. Not in the way the Vrithian engagement models predicted a fleet of 94 would move against 3,000. Not defensively. Not in a holding pattern designed to slow the advance while looking for an exit. They came forward, and they came in a configuration that Reth's tactical system spent 3 seconds trying to classify before producing a result that said unknown formation type, which was a thing Reth had never seen his tactical system say before in his entire career. Project Anvil came first. 40 ships that Reth sensors initially classified as cargo vessels because that is what they had been built as, and that is what their hull signatures still matched in the Vrithian database. They were accelerating at speeds that made no sense for vessels of their size and weight class. The engines pushing them were not the engines cargo ships were supposed to have, and Reth's tactical officer flagged the speed anomaly, and Reth looked at it and started to say redirect fire to the cargo vessels, and then the first one triggered its device and an entire section of the Vrithian formation lost communication simultaneously. Not degraded. Not disrupted in the partial way that electronic warfare usually produced. Gone. A clean collapse across every frequency that section of the fleet used to coordinate, lasting long enough for the ships inside it to become 90 individual vessels making 90 individual decisions instead of one coordinated force of 90 making one coordinated decision. Some of them held position. Some of them advanced. Some of them moved to avoid the ships next to them that were now moving unpredictably. The formation in that section stopped being a formation. Then the second anvil ship triggered. A different section. The same result. Then the third. Reth watched his formation come apart in sections the way you watch something solid develop cracks. Not all at once. Section by section. Each crack appearing where an anvil ship had passed through and triggered and moved on to clear space before the ships around it could process what had happened and respond. The Vrithian formation had been designed to function as one organism with 3,000 parts all receiving the same information and acting on it in coordination. Strip away the coordination and you did not have one organism anymore. You had 3,000 parts each doing its own thing and getting in each other's way. Bill Hayes sat in the command center on Earth and watched his display and issued adjustments in the same quiet, steady voice he had been using since the battle began. His eyes moved constantly across the information in front of him, reading the battle the way he read everything, completely and quickly, and always looking for the thing that was about to matter rather than the thing that had just happened. Tom Ward was inside the formation doing what Tom did. Flying through the chaos with a crew that had trained for exactly this kind of situation, finding the moments where being in a specific place at a specific time could multiply the confusion already spreading through the Vrithian ranks. He had been flying for 2 hours. His hands had not shaken once. His voice on the internal channels was the same calm, even tone it always was. His crew followed his lead the way crews follow commanders who have never once given them a reason to doubt. It was the most difficult flying of his life, and he did not say so out loud because saying so out loud would not have helped anything. Then Reth's command ship appeared on Bill's display. It moved forward from the rear of the formation where it had been positioned, and it was immediately obvious why Reth had held it back until now. The ship was enormous. Larger than anything else in the Vrithian fleet by a significant margin. Old in the way that things which have survived a very long time look old, not deteriorated but worn into itself, every surface carrying the weight of what it had been through. Its weapon systems were active, and they were not the same generation as the rest of the fleet. They were something older and heavier, and the power readings coming off them made Amy Cole look up from her station and say something quietly that Bill heard but did not respond to because he was already thinking about what came next. Reth was coming in personally. Bill understood what that meant. It meant the calculation had shifted for Reth. It meant that whatever confidence had returned when the fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel had been eroded enough by what he had watched happen to his formation that he had decided the only way to change the outcome was to enter it himself. The command ship was the most powerful vessel in the Vrithian fleet, and Reth was betting that nothing humanity had in this solar system could handle it directly. Bill picked up the channel to Tom. He said one thing. One target. On the other end of the channel, Tom looked at his display. Reth's command ship had appeared on it, and the size reading next to it sat there in plain numbers that Tom looked at for about 3 seconds. 3 seconds of looking at the size of a thing and measuring it against the size of what he was flying and doing the math that the numbers produced, and then deciding that the math was not the most important part of the equation. He pointed his ship at Reth's command vessel and pushed his engines to full. What happened in the next several minutes was not something that fit cleanly into a description because it was not a simple exchange of firepower between two vessels of comparable capability. It was something more complicated and more human than that. Tom flew the way he had always flown, using everything the space around him offered, using the debris from disabled ships and the gravitational influence of the nearby planets and the unpredictable movement patterns that had frustrated Vrithian targeting systems since the first engagement. Reth's command ship was more powerful, but it was also slower, and it was also being flown by a commander who was used to battles that followed rules Tom had never agreed to follow. Reth's ship fell. Not dramatically. Not in the kind of explosion that fills the sky. The systems went down in sequence the way systems go down when the right things have been hit in the right order by someone who had spent the approach figuring out what those things were and what that order was. The engines first. Then the weapons. Then the command systems. The ship drifted, massive and dark, still intact, the crew inside it alive, the commander inside it sitting in the sudden silence of a vessel that had just stopped being what it was. Without Reth, the armada stopped being an armada. It happened gradually and then quickly, the way things that have been held together by a single point of coordination come apart when that point is gone. Ships that had been following orders stopped receiving orders. Ships that had been holding positions in a formation that no longer existed stopped knowing where their positions were. The sections already disrupted by Project Anvil had been making individual decisions for the last hour, and those decisions had not been producing good results, and now the rest of the fleet joined them in the same uncertainty, and the battle did not end with a final climactic moment. It ended with a slow quiet spreading across the field as ship after ship simply stopped. Weapons powering down. Engines reducing to holding thrust. 3,000 vessels floating in various states of disarray across a wide stretch of space that an hour ago had looked like the most overwhelming military force ever directed at a single solar system. Bill sat back in his chair. He looked at his screens for a long time without saying anything. Amy was quiet at her station. The other staff in the command center moved softly and spoke in low voices if they spoke at all. Outside in the solar system, 94 human ships held their positions and waited, and the silence stretched across space in all directions. Then a channel opened from inside the Vrithian fleet. General Mohn's voice came through. He did not make a speech. He did not explain or justify or attempt to reframe what had just happened. He said one word in the flat, even tone of someone who has accepted a reality and is now dealing with it. Terms. Bill thought about what terms meant. He thought about what humanity had actually wanted before any of this started. Before the Vrithian fleet appeared on Amy's sensor report. Before Dross delivered his speech and Tom closed the channel. Before any of it. What humanity had been doing quietly in their small corner of the galaxy before something 3,000 ships strong decided they needed to be dealt with. They had wanted to exist. That was all. To build and explore and argue with each other and make mistakes and fix them and keep going. To be left alone to do those things in the particular messy human way that had been their way since the beginning. He said, "Take your ships and leave our system and never come back. That is the only term we have." Mohn agreed without a pause. No negotiation. No counteroffer. No attempt to find a version of the outcome that preserved something for the Empire. Just agreement, immediate and complete, from a being who understood exactly what the alternative was and was not interested in it. The Vrithian fleet began its long, slow withdrawal. 3,000 ships turning away from a solar system they had arrived at 9 hours ago, expecting to add to a collection of conquered worlds and leaving with nothing except a route home and a silence that none of them were going to find easy to fill with words. Reth sat in the wreckage of his command ship as it was brought slowly back into the fleet. The bridge around him was dim and quiet. Systems that had been running for decades sat offline. The ship that had ended civilizations floated dark and powerless while smaller vessels attached tow lines and began the process of moving it. He looked out through the viewport at the stars and tried to work through what had happened. Not emotionally. He was still trying to do it analytically because that was the only way he knew how to process anything. But the analysis kept arriving at conclusions that his mind did not know what to do with. Mohn stood near the doorway of the bridge. He had been standing there for a while. He waited until Reth had been quiet for long enough that it was clear he was not going to speak first. Then Mohn said, "I tried to tell you to read the full report." Reth looked at him. The look lasted a long time. Long enough that Mohn was not sure what was going to come out of it. Anger or dismissal or one of the sharp, precise responses that Reth had always been capable of producing in situations where someone was pointing out something he did not want to acknowledge. Nothing came out of it. For the first time in 40 years Reth had absolutely nothing to say. Not because he had run out of things. Because everything that existed to be said required a foundation that no longer existed. The certainty. The 40 years of unbroken results. The complete and settled belief that the force he represented was the force that always won. That foundation was sitting in pieces around him the same way his command ship systems were sitting offline, and without it the words had nothing to stand on. He looked back out at the stars. The news spread across the galaxy the way all significant news spreads. Faster than the events themselves because the people carrying it were not waiting for complete information. They were carrying what they had and filling the gaps with what they could infer, and what they could infer was enough to understand the basic shape of what had happened. An empire that had crushed civilizations for centuries had sent its full military force against one small species on one small world. The small species had won. In war rooms and intelligence offices and council chambers on 100 worlds, analysts pulled up their files on humanity and looked at what they had written there and started writing new things. Military planners revised threat assessments. Political leaders called in their senior advisors and had quiet conversations about tone and approach and the particular care that should be taken when communicating with a species that had just done what humanity had just done. Every file, every assessment, every updated record in every language used by every civilization that paid attention to such things. They all ended the same way. Do not threaten them. Do not dismiss them. Do not look at the size of their fleet or the age of their civilization or the reach of their territory and conclude that the numbers tell you everything you need to know. Do not make them come to you. Because they will come. Through your checkpoints and your patrol ships and your battle formations and 3,000 warships if that is what stands between them and what they are protecting. And they will not come as conquerors. They will not come to take what you have or put their flag on your worlds or add your maps to their walls. They will come to make sure that whatever threatened them understands that the threat did not work. They are not the oldest species in the galaxy. They are not the largest. They do not have the most ships or the deepest technology or the longest history of organized warfare. They are a young species from a single world who have been reaching toward the stars for less time than most civilizations have been keeping records. But they refuse to lose. They have always refused to lose. Against larger enemies and stronger enemies and enemies who had every measurable advantage and looked at the numbers and believed that the numbers were the whole story. The numbers were never the whole story with humans. There was always something underneath the numbers that the numbers did not capture. Something that did not show up in fleet counts or weapons assessments or technology comparisons. Something that you only discovered when you pushed hard enough to bring it out. And by the time you discovered it, you had already made the mistake that could not be unmade. The Vrithian fleet moved through space toward home. Slowly. Quietly. 3,000 ships that had left as the most powerful military force in the galaxy and were returning as something that would take a long time to define. In the command center on Earth, Bill Hayes finally stood up from his chair. He was stiff from hours of sitting, and he stretched slowly and looked around at his staff, who were beginning to breathe in the way people breathe when something enormous has passed and they are still trying to believe it. He thought about Tom Ward out there in the solar system. About Amy Cole, who had been at her station for 14 hours without a break. About every crew member on every one of those 94 ships. About the 4 crews who had not come home. He turned off his display screen. Then the one next to it. Then the main board. He picked up his cold coffee and looked at it and set it back down. Then he walked to the door of the command center and stopped and looked back at the room one more time. At the screens going dark. At the staff sitting in the quiet aftermath of the longest day any of them had ever worked. "Get some rest," he said. "All of you." He walked out into the corridor and the door closed behind him, and the command center sat in its quiet with the screens dark and the battle over, and somewhere outside in the solar system the stars looked exactly the same as they always had. They always did. It was the galaxy underneath them that had changed.